Vikings invade Paris. The year is 845 AD. The Seine runs thick with mist and blood dot from the northern horizon. 100 dragon-proud ships slice through the fog, their sails black as ravens, their shields flashing beneath a cold gray sun. At their head, the legendary Ragnar Lodbrok, a name whispered with both fear and awe. The Franks in Paris believe their great stone walls and faith in God will protect them. But they are about to learn what happens when faith meets fury. In a single spring, these Norsemen will burn villages, enslave thousands, and demand a ransom that will shake the empire of Charlemagne to its knees. It is not just a raid, it is a reckoning. Most people know the Vikings as seafaring raiders. Few know this, that in 845 AD the Franks faced a siege so devastating. It changed how Europe would defend itself for centuries. And as the bells of Paris begin to toll, a question hangs in the smoke. Can a city built on faith survive a storm of fire and steel? Before we uncover this forgotten war, make sure you subscribe, like, and comment your favorite ancient battle below. You're about to witness history the way it was never told. The thunder from the north, the morning sky over Scandinavia was the color of iron. Wind tore across the fjords, carrying the cries of ravens and the scent of salt and pine. In a longhouse lit by firelight, men sharpened axes whose edges gleamed like moonlight on ice. Ragnar Lodbrok stood among them, a tall figure with eyes that burned colder than the sea he ruled. He wasn't born a king. He became one through storms, blood, and the belief that fate itself bowed to his will. They said Odin whispered to him in dreams that he saw visions of great cities built not of timber, but of stone and gold, places ripe for the taking. And among them, one name lingered like a challenge from the gods: Paris. The Franks called their land Christendom's heart. But to the Norse it was something else, a treasure chest left unguarded at the edge of the world. For years, Viking raiders had tested Frankish coasts, plundering monasteries, burning villages, and vanishing back into the sea before the Franks could respond. But this would be different. Ragnar was not coming for plunder. He was coming to make the gods remember his name, and so, in the year 845, the north erupted. From Denmark, from Norway, from the frozen coasts of Jutland, they came, farmers turned fighters, bound by oath and hunger. 100 ships assembled at the mouth of the Seine, their hulls carved like dragon spines. Their sails dyed with blood-red patterns meant to terrify even before the first axe fell. The Seine, a river that once carried merchants and monks, was about to carry death itself. As they rowed inland, oars struck water in perfect rhythm. The sound was like a heartbeat, the heartbeat of an army. Smoke rose from burning villages along the banks. Livestock fled into the forests, and word began to spread: the Northmen are coming. Inside the monasteries, monks hid relics beneath the altars and whispered prayers to saints who could no longer hear them over the roar of war. But here's the shocking truth: most people never knew the Franks, despite their mighty empire, were not ready. The empire of Charlemagne had fractured after his death, leaving his grandsons to rule in fragments, bickering over territory while their enemies united. When the Vikings came, the Franks had walls but no unity, soldiers but no will. In Paris, panic took root. The bells of the great church of Saint-Germain tolled day and night as refugees poured in. Farmers spoke of ships that seemed endless. Priests called it divine punishment for the sins of men. And in the royal court, Emperor Charles the Bald faced the truth. He had never seen an enemy like this. The Viking fleet moved with unnatural precision, striking both banks of the river simultaneously. Their scouts used captured locals to map the bends and fords. Their warriors, hardened by winters no Frankish soldier could survive, fought with a savage discipline born from necessity. Ragnar's flagship led the way, its prow carved in the shape of a roaring beast, its sail tattered but defiant. At its bow, Ragnar himself stood bareheaded in the cold wind. He wore no crown, only a rough cloak of Volf fur. To his men, he was more than a chieftain. He was the storm-made flesh. And yet, even as the river carried them closer to Paris, Ragnar was not smiling, because he knew something the others didn't. The Franks were rich. Yes, but wealth attracts not only greed, but fate. And fate has a cruel sense of timing. By the seventh day, the Viking fleet reached Rouen. The city fell with almost no resistance. Its gates burned, its treasures looted, its survivors enslaved. But this was only the beginning. Rouen became Ragnar's staging ground, the first scar carved into Frankish pride. From there, he sent a message to Paris. It was simple: prepare tribute, or prepare to burn. The Franks didn't believe it. They thought this was another raid, a handful of barbarians soon to be crushed. So Charles gathered what forces he could: remnants of old legions, peasants with rusted swords, monks who carried crosses instead of shields. They built defenses along the river, waiting to ambush Ragnar's ships near a small island fort known as Sight Island, the heart of Paris itself. But fate had something else planned. At dawn, a thick fog rolled in, so dense that even the riverbanks vanished. The Franks couldn't see the ships until they were already upon them. By the time the alarm bells rang, Viking archers were raining fire across the water. Arrows hissed through the mist like ghosts. Torches fell upon thatched roofs. The Seine blazed red, the defenders broke. The Vikings swarmed ashore. Shouting the name of Odin, the clash of steel echoed against cathedral walls. And here's what no chronicler of the time dared admit: the Franks didn't fight for their faith that morning. They fought for survival. Even the mighty cross of St. Denis, raised to bless the soldiers, was struck down in the chaos. Within hours, the city gates were sealed. Paris had become a trap for both sides. Ragnar ordered his men to cut off all bridges, isolating the city completely. No one in, no one out. Smoke and screams filled the air from the cathedral tower. Priests watched as the Norsemen danced in the streets outside, beating drums made from captured shields. They called to the Franks to come out and fight, but none did. Days turned into weeks. Supplies dwindled. Disease crept through the narrow streets. Even the Emperor's council began to whisper that maybe, just maybe, the gods of the North had proven stronger than the god of Rome. And then came the moment that changed everything. On the 17th day, Ragnar ordered something unthinkable. He had captured a group of Christian prisoners, soldiers, and priests alike. Before the walls of Paris, he hung them from trees along the riverbank. One for every day of the siege. It wasn't madness. It was psychology. He wanted the Franks to see, to feel, that every hour they resisted, they would pay in blood. The message worked. Inside the walls, panic turned to despair. Emperor Charles, desperate and outmatched, sent envoys under a white flag. They begged Ragnar for mercy, but here's where history bends. Most tellings end with ransom and retreat, but few know what truly happened next. Ragnar, legend says, laughed when he saw the envoys approach. He demanded gold, silver, and food, enough to fill 70 wagons. And when the Franks agreed, he made one final demand. He wanted the emperor himself to deliver it, and Charles the Bald did. Imagine it. The ruler of a Christian empire standing before a pagan warlord, hands trembling as he offered silver for peace. Ragnar said nothing. He simply nodded once, and turned away. As the gold was loaded onto the ships, Paris held its breath. The Vikings could have destroyed everything, yet they didn't. They left the city smoldering, humiliated, but alive. But why? Why spare the city he could have erased from the map? Because Ragnar wasn't finished. His mission wasn't destruction, it was prophecy. He believed this victory had been foretold, that he would one day stand before a greater king, one far beyond Paris, and meet his true fate there. And so, as the longships turned northward, the Seine fell silent again. The people of Paris emerged from hiding, trembling, their city blackened but standing. And on the wind, the ravens circled once more, as if marking the sky with a warning. The North had tasted empire, and it would return. What happened next, no one in Europe was ready for. The Franks thought they had bought peace, but they had only paid for time. The river of fire, the Seine, had gone silent. For a moment, the only sound was the creak of wooden hulls rocking against the current, and the distant wailing of Paris. Ragnar Lodbrok stood at the prow of his ship, his hands resting on the carved beast that led his fleet. Behind him, the river burned. Flames danced on the water like living spirits, feeding on the oil and pitch spilled from Frankish boats. Smoke curled upward in black ribbons that blotted out the sun. The battle for Paris was not over, it was changing. The ransom had been paid. The silver counted, yet the hunger in his men's eyes had not faded. They had seen the riches of Christendom, the gold chalices, the jeweled crosses, the trembling nobles who paid to breathe another day. Wealth beyond imagination, and it had come easily. Too easily. Reginheri knew what his warriors were thinking. If Paris had fallen once, it could fall again. But deep within him, something else stirred, not greed, but foreboding. He could feel the pull of destiny tightening around him like a noose. The gods had given him victory, yes. But at a price. The storm clouds rolling in from the north seemed to whisper it. You are not done yet. Ragnar, days after the ransom, the Vikings began their withdrawal. They loaded their ships with treasure, captives, and relics stolen from holy altars. The oars dipped into the river, sending ripples across the scorched reflection of the city they had nearly destroyed. But as the fleet drifted downstream, something strange happened. Men began to fall ill. At first, it was small, a cough here, a fever there. Then, within days, warriors were collapsing at their oars, sweating and delirious. Even the strongest among them grew weak. Some said it was the wrath of the Christian God, a divine punishment for defiling holy ground. Others believed it was the curse of the Seine, the river's revenge for the blood it had swallowed. Whatever it was, Ragnar felt it too. His skin burned. His vision blurred. By the time the fleet reached Rouen again, the great chieftain could barely stand. His warriors carried him to the shore, laying him beneath a blood-red sunset. The same river that had carried him to glory now seemed to whisper his doom, but he did not die, not yet. Instead, he dreamed. In his fevered visions, he saw ravens circling above a pit of snakes. He heard the voice of Odin calling his name across the storm. He saw Paris again, not as a city of stone, but as a serpent coiled around his destiny, and when he awoke, Ragnar laughed. Not in madness, but in understanding. He had seen his fate. And he would meet it head-on, but for now he ordered the fleet to retreat north, carrying their spoils homeward. Paris, humiliated but spared, licked its wounds in silence, inside its blackened walls. Emperor Charles the Bald paced the cathedral floor, his crown heavy with shame. He had paid a pagan warlord for mercy, and in doing so had shattered the illusion of divine protection. The empire whispered that God had abandoned them. Monks recorded the siege in trembling Latin, describing it as the scourge of the north. Yet none dared write the truth, that the mighty Franks, heirs to Charlemagne, had bowed before a heathen from the sea, and still, even in their despair, they tried to convince themselves it was over, but it wasn't. The Seine had been marked, not just by blood, but by memory. The Vikings had discovered the river's secret, that it was a road straight into the heart of France. And once a Viking knows a path, he never forgets it. Months later, long after Ragnar's fleet had vanished beyond the horizon, new sails appeared in the north. They were not led by him, but by those who had fought beside him, sons of the same storm. They came not as raiders this time, but as conquerors. Paris, terrified and unprepared, could only watch as the Northmen returned, their numbers greater, their ambition unrestrained. The city's defenders rebuilt bridges and fortified walls. Yet even the strongest stones could not silence the memory of what had happened that spring. The sight of Viking ships on the horizon sent entire villages fleeing into the forests. Bells tolled not for mass, but for warning, and here's the part most histories gloss over. The Franks tried to turn their faith into a weapon. They carried holy relics into battle, believing divine power could repel the invaders. But when the first arrow struck the bishop leading the defense, their courage broke like glass. Meanwhile, the Vikings adapted. They learned the river's currents, its tides, its shallow bends where ships could ground and strike like serpents from the water. They built floating barricades, false retreats, ambush tactics far ahead of their time. To the Franks, the Seine had always been sacred. To the Vikings, it was a weapon, one fateful night. As rain poured in sheets across the water, a Frankish garrison near St. Denis lit torches along the riverbank. They believed Ragnar's men were gone for good. They drank, sang hymns, and mocked the northern gods. Then, from the darkness, came the sound of drums. Slow, rhythmic, growing louder. Before the first alarm could sound, flaming arrows streaked through the rain. The night exploded in chaos. Tents caught fire. Horses screamed. The Seine once again reflected the color of blood. The Vikings had returned. And this time there would be no ransom. In the chaos, an old rumor reached the Frankish ranks that Ragnar Lodbrok himself had died of plague after leaving Paris, but another rumor followed it, that his sons were gathering armies of their own, that they sought vengeance for their father's sickness, vengeance on the empire that dared to defy him, and so the raid on Paris became something greater, the opening act of a saga that would soon engulf all of Europe. But in 845, the Franks did not yet know the storm's true scale. They believed they had survived the worst. They believed paying silver had bought their peace. What they couldn't see was that peace itself had become the trap, because gold is a language the world understands, and now every warlord from the north had heard it. Ragnar's victory had done more than break the Franks. It had taught every Viking that empires could bleed. By the next spring, new fleets assembled across the North Sea, from Hedeby, from Trondheim, from the icy fjords of Norway. Ships by the hundreds, drawn by the same promise that once called Ragnar down the Seine. And in Paris, the people prayed harder than ever. They built taller walls. They filled the Seine with chains meant to block the ships. But deep down, they knew the truth. Faith cannot stop the tide. Even Charles the Bald, once so proud, confessed to his advisers that the gold he had paid felt cursed. Every coin bought silence, but also invited more shadows. What happened next would echo through every monastery, every court, every battlefield in the centuries to come, because in saving Paris, Charles had unknowingly doomed it to be attacked again and again. He had bought survival, not safety, and as the Viking ships disappeared into the mist once more, their oars cutting through the glowing water, a single voice rose from the shore. It was a monk. Trembling as he watched the flames consume the river, he whispered a prophecy. That which flows in peace shall one day flow in war again. And when the ravens return, no silver will be enough. The river carried his words into the fog, toward the north, toward destiny. For the Vikings, this was not an ending. It was an awakening. And as the cold wind swept across the ashes of the Seine, the world below Christendom's crown began to shift, because Ragnar Lodbrok had shown the north that kings could be humbled. And in that revelation, an empire was reborn in the shape of a longship. The river would burn again. The ravens would feast again, and when they came, they would not ask for ransom. They would ask for history itself. The siege begins. Paris, spring of 845 AD, the city still stank of smoke. Walls blackened from fire, bridges half rebuilt, the echo of screams lingering like ghosts in the narrow streets. The people had returned to their homes, but peace had not returned to them. Every creak of a boat on the river made them flinch. Every gust of northern wind carried a memory of sails, of fire, of the men who came from the sea. But on this morning, the wind felt heavier, cold, ominous. From the ramparts, sentries stared at the river's bend. There, just beyond the mist, a dark shape moved. Then another, and another. Soon the horizon shimmered with black sails. They were back. The bells of Notre Dame clanged in alarm. Priests ran through the streets shouting prayers. Children were dragged indoors, and the last merchants abandoned their stalls. Panic was instant, absolute. Inside the royal hall, Emperor Charles the Bald stood frozen as his advisors spoke over one another. Some demanded battle. Others urged retreat. But Charles had learned from the first invasion, courage alone could not stop the north. This time he had built fortifications, gathered fresh soldiers, even forged alliances with neighboring lords, and yet, as the Viking fleet advanced, old preparation felt meaningless. The ships moved like a living creature, each hull in perfect rhythm with the next. Painted shields lined their sides, red, black, and gold, flashing like scales of a great serpent winding. Its way up the Seine, the roar of oars striking the water rolled. Across the plain like thunder at their head sailed a new banner, the raven of Ragnar Lodbrok. But the man beneath it was not Ragnar. The stories said he had died, consumed by illness on the voyage home. Yet the banner remained. And at its helm stood a younger warrior, fierce and unyielding, Bjorn Ironside, Ragnar's son. He had come not to raid. He had come to finish what his father began. The Franks watched in silence as the fleet stopped just beyond bowshot. Drums began to pound low and steady. Horns answered from the walls. The river that once brought trade and life to Paris was now the stage for vengeance, and here's the haunting truth. No one inside those walls knew whether they were witnessing another raid or the beginning of something far greater. God, as the drums ceased, Bjorn rose to his feet. In his hand he held a blackened cross, taken, it was said, from a monastery his father had burned. He raised it high, then flung it into the river. The message was clear. Faith would not save them. The siege of Paris had begun. For the first few days, the Vikings tested the walls. They attacked the gates with axes, set fire to the wooden palisades, and loosed flaming arrows over the battlements. But the Franks held firm. This time they were ready. Archers rained bolts upon the attackers. Boiling oil poured down from the towers. Bjorn's men suffered heavy losses. The Franks cheered. For the first time, they believed they could stand against the north, but their hope was short-lived. At nightfall, the river itself became the Vikings' weapon. Using the current, they launched unmanned rafts covered in pitch and straw, floating fire that crashed against the city's bridges and ignited them in spectacular bursts. The defenders rushed to douse the flames, but the river betrayed them. The Seine carried death in every direction. From the northern shore, Viking warriors surged through the smoke. They attacked where the fire burned brightest, because that was where the walls were weakest. The battle raged until dawn. Blood soaked the stone streets. The river's surface shimmered red beneath the first light of day. By the third week, famine set in. The siege tightened. The Franks had food enough for perhaps 10 days. Water was tainted. Disease spread faster than hope. Inside the cathedral, the priests clutched relics and prayed for deliverance. But their God remained silent. Outside the walls, the Vikings sang war songs to Odin, their voices echoing over the dead, and yet, amidst the suffering, a strange resolve began to grow among the Parisians. They refused to flee. They refused to surrender, led by Count Odo, a commander whose courage would one day make him a king. The defenders built barricades, repaired breaches, and launched daring raids across the bridges. Odo himself led one, riding through fire and chaos to drive the Norsemen back across the river. His sword was said to gleam so bright it could be seen from the cathedral tower. For a brief moment, the tide seemed to turn. The Franks struck back with new weapons, massive crossbows mounted on the walls, capable of piercing shields and armor. Every Viking that fell fed the hope of the starving city, but Bjorn Ironside was no fool. He changed his strategy. Instead of frontal assaults, he turned to deception. He ordered his men to feign retreat, leaving behind fires and bodies as if they'd been wiped out. The Franks, believing the siege had broken, opened their gates in celebration. That night, as they drank and sang, Bjorn returned, under cover of darkness. By dawn, flames once again engulfed the city. The streets ran with panic. The bells that had rung in victory now tolled in despair. Bjorn's warriors flooded through the breaches, cutting down soldiers, monks, even nobles, and amid the chaos, the young Viking stood atop the city walls and raised his father's banner once more. Paris was his, but fate, as always, had other plans. On the 5th day of their occupation, a plague began to spread among the invaders. Men who had feasted on the spoils of the city now lay writhing in agony. Some claimed the disease came from the rotting corpses piled along the riverbanks. Others whispered it was divine retribution, that the relics they had stolen carried curses meant for the Faithles. Bjorn refused to believe it. But when his closest captains fell sick, even he began to waver. He ordered his men to withdraw beyond the city walls. They dragged their wounded back to the ships, leaving the streets littered with both Frankish and Norse dead. And then, in a cruel echo of his father's fate, Bjorn too began to weaken. Fever gripped him. For days, he lay aboard his flagship, drifting between delirium and silence, but before his mind faded, he gave a final order. He commanded his men to spare Paris. No more slaughter. No more fire. He would not repeat the sins that cursed his father's fleet. Instead, he demanded only tribute and safe passage north. The Franks, broken and terrified, agreed. Gold was gathered once again. The same ritual as before, silver weighed, carts filled, and carried down to the riverbank under banners of truce. As the Vikings prepared to depart, a heavy silence fell over the city. The people of Paris watched from their windows as the longships drifted away. Some wept, some cursed. None cheered. They had survived, but at a cost that could never be counted. And as the black sails vanished into the horizon, Count Odo turned to his emperor and spoke the words no one wanted to hear. This is not the end. He was right. In the years to come, the Vikings would return again and again. They would besiege Paris in 856, in 861, and again in 885, each time stronger, each time hungrier. The Franks had fought with courage. But courage alone cannot stop history, because history moves like a river, winding, relentless and impossible to dam. That river carried a new tide, a tide of vengeance. Far to the north, the sons of Ragnar gathered in secret. They spoke of their father's death, of the sickness that took him, of the humiliation of silver paid by Christian kings. They swore oaths of blood. To one day return, not for gold, not for tribute, but for conquest. The age of raids was ending. The age of invasion was about to begin. The fire that started on the Seine would soon spread across Europe, but that is a story for another night. For now, the river sleeps under the shadow of its own history, waiting for the sound of oars once more. And when they come, they will come not as raiders, but as the storm itself. Gold for mercy. Paris, 845 AD. The smoke of battle had faded, yet its scent lingered, burnt oak, wet ash, and something heavier, the sour weight of fear. Inside the shattered walls, Emperor Charles the Bald sat motionless upon his throne, his crown tilted, his eyes distant. Outside, the city lay in ruin, its churches looted, its people starving, its streets still dark with blood. He had done the unthinkable. He had paid barbarians to leave his empire in peace. But peace, he now understood, was not a gift. It was a purchase. And peace bought with gold is peace that never lasts. Charles's counselors debated how much treasure remained. Not enough, they whispered. Not enough to feed the army, rebuild the walls, and still pay the price the Northmen demanded. But what choice did they have? The fleet still waited beyond the Seine, hundreds of ships, their sails black with soot and pride. The Vikings had promised to withdraw only when the silver was delivered, and every hour the payment delayed. More fires appeared along the river banks. Inside the palace, the emperor's hands shook as he signed the order. 7,000 pounds of silver. The greatest ransom in Europe's history. But here's what few know. Even as Charles prepared the tribute, he began to plan something darker. A way to ensure that this would never happen again. Meanwhile, down by the river, Bjorn Ironside walked among his men. The once proud warriors now looked weary, hollow-eyed. The plague that had swept their camp still lingered. Some coughed blood, others stumbled with fever. Yet they refused to show weakness before the Franks. To die in battle was glory. To die in sickness was shame. Bjorn understood. He felt it in his bones, the same sickness that had claimed his father. But he would not let it take him here, in this land of soft kings and trembling priests. He had come to prove Ragnar's legacy, not to be buried beneath it. As the sun sank over the Seine, Bjorn watched the priests of Paris drag carts of silver toward his camp. The sound of coins clattering together was almost melodic, a hymn of humiliation. One of his men spat on the ground. "They pay us like frightened children," he said. Bjorn's gaze hardened. No, he murmured. They pay us like kings. The next morning, the exchange began. The gates of Paris opened under guard. Monks carried chests engraved with the sigil of Charlemagne himself. The silver gleamed in the light, each coin stamped with the cross of Christ. The Franks knelt as they presented it, but none dared look Bjorn in the eye. He said nothing. He only gestured for the treasure to be counted and loaded aboard the ships. And yet, something about the moment felt wrong. From the towers of Paris, smoke rose again. Not from fire this time, but from incense. The priests were burning relics, chanting blessings to cleanse the city of pagan corruption. A hollow ritual meant to banish fear, but even as the chants filled the air, spies moved through the shadows. Charles had sent riders to the east, summoning reinforcements from other provinces. The plan was simple. Once the Vikings had loaded their ships and turned downstream, the Frankish cavalry would strike from both banks, trapping them in the river's narrow bends. It was a plan born of desperation. And desperation breeds treachery. That night, as the Vikings feasted beside their campfires, a hooded figure appeared on the riverbank. A Frankish monk, trembling, clutching a small iron cross. He begged to see Bjorn. When brought before him, the monk fell to his knees and whispered, "You are betrayed. The king plots against you. They will strike when you depart." The camp fell silent. Bjorn studied the man's face, gaunt, sincere, frightened. Then he smiled faintly. "You've just saved your city," he said. The monk blinked in confusion. Bjorn leaned closer. "Because now I will not leave quietly." At dawn, the Franks awoke to the sound of horns, not from their towers, but from the Viking ships. The Northmen were on the move. The river churned beneath their oars as they turned, not away from Paris, but toward it. The soldiers on the walls shouted in disbelief. Wasn't the ransom paid? Wasn't the war over? Bjorn raised his father's banner high. "Let them see," he said. "Let them remember who we are." The longships surged forward. The attack came swift and merciless. The Franks, unprepared for renewed battle, faltered instantly. Bridges collapsed under the weight of fire. Arrows rained upon the defenders. The Seine once again burned with pitch and oil. Inside the palace, Charles the Bald realized his plan had failed before it even began. The Vikings stormed the outer ramparts. Drums thundered. The air filled with smoke and screams, and then silence. Bjorn stood in the heart of Paris once more. The same streets his father had conquered. The same walls that had once trembled before Ragnar Lodbrok's fury, but this time there was no laughter. No glory. Bjorn looked upon the burning city, and felt something he did not expect. Weariness, a hollow ache where triumph should have been. He remembered his father's final words. "Power is not what you take, but what you leave behind." He knew now what that meant. To take Paris was victory. To hold it was death. Bjorn gave the order. Stop the slaughter. Spare the people. Let the emperor live. His warriors hesitated, confused, but obeyed. The Northmen began to withdraw, leaving behind ruins but not ashes. On the seventh day, Bjorn met with Charles face to face. The emperor's crown was gone. His robes were torn. Yet in his eyes flickered a spark of pride, or perhaps defiance. "You could have destroyed us," he said quietly. "Why didn't you?" Bjorn's answer came like the river itself, calm but unstoppable. "Because my father already did." He turned, signaling his fleet. The Vikings began to board their ships, their holds overflowing with silver. As they pushed off from the banks, a single raven circled overhead. Gliding through the smoke, most believed it was a sign, Odin's blessing. Proof that the gods had favored them once more. But for Charles, watching from the tower, it felt like something else. A warning, because as the longships disappeared down the Seine, he realized what the true cost of victory had been. Not the gold, not the blood, but the fear left behind. That fear spread across his empire like a plague. Villages fortified their churches. Lords built new castles. Farmers hid their sons from military service. And in the north, stories of Ragnar and his sons grew larger than life. Tales whispered by fireside, teaching a generation that no wall could keep out the sea. The empire would never be the same, and yet In the silence after the fleet was gone, Charles stood alone on the ramparts, staring at the empty river. For the first time he heard nothing, no drums, no oars, no horns, only the quiet. He should have felt relief. But instead he felt haunted. He thought of the silver, the gold for mercy, now sailing toward lands unknown. And he thought of the words his advisors had spoken in fear. If you pay a Volf once, it will always come back for more. He looked toward the horizon and whispered, then let them come. But deep down, even he knew they would, for somewhere in the cold north, other sons of Ragnar waited. They had heard the songs, seen the treasures, felt the pull of the same destiny that drove their father to the walls of Paris. And one day, they too would come down the rivers, not for ransom, but for conquest. The empire would tremble again. The north had tasted gold. Next, it would taste power. And when that day came, mercy would no longer be for sale. The Seine would burn once more. The Raven's legacy, the Seine slept beneath a silver fog. Its waters, once crimson from war, now flowed quietly past the blackened remains of towers and bridges. The people of Paris tried to forget. They rebuilt their homes, reforged their bells, and prayed that the river and the men who came from it would never rise again. But rivers remember. They remember every reflection of fire, every scream that echoed across their surface. And somewhere far to the north, the sons of Ragnar Lodbrok remembered too. Years had passed since the siege of 845 AD. Charles the Bald had grown older, wearier, haunted by the ghost of that terrible spring. Though he ruled his empire with trembling hands, his nights were filled with visions, ships gliding through fog, shields shining like serpents, the sound of oars beating like a war drum beneath his dreams, because in his heart, he knew it was not over. Ragnar's blood still ran in the veins of his sons, Bjorn Ironside, Ivar the Boneless, Sigurd Snake in the Halfdan, and each carried a piece of their father's legend, and each burned with the same fire that once lit the skies above Paris. But this new generation sought something greater than gold. They sought vengeance. The Franks believed they had paid for peace. But in the halls of the north, the gold they had sent southward gleamed like an insult. It was not tribute, it was proof. Proof that kings could kneel, that empires could bleed. And so the sons of Ragnar began to whisper of a new war, one not for ransom, but for destiny. In the icy dawns of Denmark, warriors gathered under banners marked by ravens. Black wings stretched wide against the white of snow. Seers cast runes into the frost and saw visions of burning cathedrals, shattered armies, and a crown sinking beneath the waves. The gods have chosen, they said. The sons of Ragnar will avenge him, and the world will remember their wrath. Far to the west, word reached Frankish shores. Merchants brought tales of shipyards filled with longboats, of chieftains uniting tribes once divided by feud. And among these rumors came one more terrifying still, that Ivar the Boneless, the most cunning of Ragnar's sons, had sworn to destroy every kingdom that mocked his father's name, but Charles dismissed it. He believed the empire had seen the worst the north could bring. He was wrong. One winter's morning, the bells of Paris tolled once more, not for mass, but for alarm. From the walls, sentries saw the river darken again. Not with mist, but with sails, dozens, then hundreds. The fleet stretched across the horizon like a black tide. This was no raid. This was retribution. The sons of Ragnar had come. Inside the city, panic spread faster than the smoke that soon followed. Villages along the Seine fell one by one, their churches stripped, their people scattered, and behind every burning steeple, the raven banners rose higher. Charles sent messengers south and east, begging for aid from neighboring lords. But the roads were cut off, the rivers blocked. Paris stood alone again, and yet there was one man who refused to bow to despair. Count Odo, the same warrior who had faced Bjorn years before, now commanded the defense. He had seen what courage could do against terror. He had seen how faith, sharpened by fire, could turn fear into fury. As the Viking fleet anchored outside the city walls, Odo rallied his men. He climbed the ramparts and raised his sword high. Paris does not kneel twice, he shouted. If they want our gold, they will have to dig it from our graves. The soldiers roared in answer. The gates were sealed. The siege had begun again. This time, it was longer, harder. The Vikings surrounded the city by land and water, cutting off all escape. They built siege engines from the timber of burned villages, launching boulders and flaming tar into the streets. The Franks fought with desperate courage. Archers lined the walls, pouring arrows like rain. Catapults hurled stones into the Viking camps. Odo himself led nightly raids beyond the gates, striking suddenly, vanishing before dawn. For months, the battle raged like a living storm, and as both sides bled, the river bore witness once again. The Seine's surface shimmered with floating corpses. Frankish and Norse alike carried silently toward the sea, but even war grows weary of itself. By the end of the second month, the Viking supplies ran low. Disease returned. Even Ivar's fierce warriors began to falter. The siege that was meant to be swift now dragged into hunger and exhaustion. In his tent, Bjorn Ironside, older now, scarred and weary, stared into the fire. His brother Ivar sat beside him, his sharp eyes burning with cold calculation. "They will break soon," Ivar hissed. "A few more weeks, and the city will fall." Bjorn shook his head. "And what then? Another river of blood? Another mountain of gold that brings only sickness?" Ivar's gaze hardened. "You sound like father before he grew weak." Bjorn rose, gripping his sword. "Our father wasn't weak. He saw the truth before any of us, that no victory lasts forever. That men remember fear more than glory." Silence hung between them like a blade. Outside, thunder rolled across the river. Rain began to fall, turning the battlefield into a mire of mud and blood. The next day, a white flag appeared on the walls of Paris. Charles once again sought negotiation. But this time he would not face his enemies himself. Instead, he sent priests to plead for peace, carrying holy relics and promises of tribute. Ivar laughed when he saw them. "He sends his god to bargain where he will not." Bjorn, however, said nothing. He turned away, his expression unreadable. The priests were brought before the Viking leaders. Their robes were soaked, their hands trembling as they offered gold and silver in exchange for mercy. Bjorn's warriors jeered, but he silenced them. He stared at the treasure, then at the city beyond, a broken jewel clinging to its faith. Finally, he spoke. "Tell your emperor," he said slowly, "that I accept his silver. But not for peace. For memory." The priests didn't understand, but they bowed and withdrew. That night, the Vikings began to pack their camps. The siege was lifted from the walls. The Franks watched in disbelief as the great fleet departed, disappearing into the mist as silently as it had come. The river swallowed them once again. Paris had survived. Again, but deep beneath their relief lay something darker. The Franks realized the north could come and go as it pleased. That no wall, no army, no faith could stop it forever, and that was the legacy of the Ravens. Ragnar had once come to Paris to test his fate. His sons had come to prove it. And though the Franks lived, they would forever live in fear of the river that carried death. In the decades that followed, the Viking raids continued on monasteries, towns, entire kingdoms. The North became legend, its warriors myth. But every tale led back to one place, one river, one siege. Paris, the city that bought its life with silver. Centuries later, the people of France would still whisper of that spring. They would point to the Seine on misty mornings and say, "That's where the ravens flew." And somewhere beyond the waves, in the halls of Valhalla, Ragnar Lodbrok would hear their words and smile, because he had not conquered a city. He had conquered time. His sons would fade. His empire would crumble. But his name, his legend, would live forever. The siege of 845 AD was not the end of a war. It was the beginning of a myth written in smoke and blood, carried by the river, whispered by the wind, and remembered by those who still dare to dream of the age when the North ruled the waves. And perhaps, one day, when the mists rise again over the Seine, the ravens will return, not for gold, not for vengeance, but simply because the river remembers them, and the river never forgets.